In November 2022, the captain of a small cargo vessel vanished during a routine supply run across the South Pacific. When his ship was discovered drifting without power, there was no sign of the crew. 6 days later, he was found alone in a lifeboat, dehydrated but alive. To this day, he has never been able to fully explain how he survived or what he encountered on that island. This is the account he gave.
I'd spent most of my life at sea. 40 years as a deckhand, an officer, a captain. By the time you'd crossed every ocean more times than you can count, you start to think you've seen everything the water can do, every mood it can turn in, every trick it can play. That night proved me wrong. We were a small cargo vessel, running a contracted supply route from Malaysia to Papua New Guinea. A simple run, 10 days out, unload, 10 days back. Nothing complicated. The kind of voyage I could have done half asleep. It was the 8th day when the radios died. No warning, just a thin crackle, a hiss of static, and then silence. I remember standing by the console, tapping the receiver as if that would help. The first mate, Grayson, looked at me across the bridge, waiting for my reaction. "It's the relay," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Probably just the relay." But in the pit of my stomach, something heavier settled, a feeling I hadn't had in years. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to recognition. Outside the wheelhouse windows, the sky had begun to turn. Low clouds, the color of bruises, crawled over the moon. The sea changed, too. Its surface lost that familiar restless shimmer and went flat, almost oily, reflecting the sky in dull, shifting patterns. The barometer was dropping faster than I'd ever seen. Grayson checked the instruments. "Wind's picking up." I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a bank of cloud rose in an unnatural wall, smooth and unbroken. It wasn't a squall line. No lightning, no roiling columns, just a seamless sheet of darkness swallowing the stars. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. "Secure the deck," I said, finally, voice steady though my chest had gone tight, "and check the lifeboats, just in case." He hesitated, searching my face for something. Reassurance, maybe. When he didn't find it, he turned without a word and disappeared down the companionway. I stayed at the helm. I told myself it was just another storm, that we'd ride it out as we always had. But some deeper instinct kept whispering that this was different. When the wind came, it came all at once. One moment the sea was a silent sheet. The next it rose in jagged peaks that hammered the hull with a force that made the metal groan. I gripped the wheel, fighting to keep our heading. The rain started a heartbeat later, hard, driving sheets that turned the deck into a river of cold water. Over the scream of the wind, I thought I heard something else, a distant note, almost musical, threading between the gusts, a kind of hum that made my teeth ache. I tried to ignore it. Lightning flashed, stark and blue-white, but there was no thunder, just that low vibration pulsing through the hull. I don't know how long we fought the storm. Minutes? An hour? Time stretched and buckled until it lost all meaning. Then, as quickly as it began, the wind died, the rain ceased. I lifted my head, blinking rainwater from my eyes. The sea had gone mirror smooth again. The sky overhead was empty. No stars, no moon, no clouds. Just a blank, lightless expanse. The instruments were dark. The compass spun idly, the needle circling with no resistance. I took a breath, realizing I hadn't exhaled in what felt like minutes.
I stepped out onto the deck. The boards were slick under my boots. A hush lay over the ship, deep enough that it felt as though the ocean itself were holding its breath. Grayson emerged from the shadows by the forward hatch. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Captain," he said hoarsely, "you need to see this." I followed him to the port rail. The sea stretched flat to every horizon. No sign of land or ships, no sign of the storm that had nearly torn us apart. But maybe that wasn't the strangest thing. The water was luminous. Not bright, just a faint blue phosphorescence that pulsed in time with something I couldn't name. For a moment it looked almost beautiful. Then I realized it was moving. Patterns swirling under the surface, tracing lines I couldn't quite follow. I felt my breath hitch, and in that instant I knew something had changed. We weren't where we'd been, and we weren't going back. I don't remember the impact itself. One moment, I was gripping the port rail watching those phosphorescent patterns slide beneath the hull. The next, there was a jolt so violent it knocked the air out of my chest and sent me sprawling across the deck. I must have blacked out. When I came to, the world was swaying in sickening lurches. My cheek was pressed to the planks, slick with seawater. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. My mind refused to accept the darkness pressing down on every side. Then memory returned in a rush. The storm, the impossible calm, the lights in the water, and the sound. That low hum was back, reverberating through the timbers like some vast chord struck in the bones of the ship itself. I forced myself up to my hands and knees. The air smelled wrong, salt and something sweet, almost floral. My head throbbed with each heartbeat. I reached for the rail and hauled myself to my feet. Around me, the deck was chaos. Cargo crates had broken free, smashed into the scuppers. The forward mast was down, rigging tangled like wet rope over the hatches. Grayson was nowhere in sight. "Grayson!" I tried to shout, but it came out ragged, barely a whisper. My throat burned, raw from salt spray and shouting. I staggered toward the wheelhouse. The windows were shattered. Inside, the instruments were a ruin of glass and sparking wires. The compass still spun, but slower now, like it was winding down to a final stop. Through the broken panes, I saw the outline of land, a dark smudge rising out of the glowing sea. I blinked, heart lurching. Land! The deck shifted again, a long groan deep in the hull. Water surged over my boots, cold enough to make me gasp. The ship was settling, nose down. I turned back toward the aft companionway, calling for any surviving crew. No answer. Just the hush of water creeping higher, the humming growing fainter. Some part of me knew I couldn't stay. Whatever had pulled us here, storm or current or something less explainable, it wasn't finished. I stumbled to the port lifeboat, fumbling with the release latches. The mechanism stuck halfway, rust binding it in place. I threw my weight against the lever until it gave with a metallic shriek. The boat dropped the last few feet and hit the water with a hollow slap. I didn't let myself think. I clambered over the rail and dropped into the lifeboat, the impact rattling my teeth. My hands moved automatically, untying the painter line and pushing off. For a moment, I looked back at the ship, my ship. The Mistral Dawn had carried me across more miles than I could count. I'd walked her decks in every weather. Now she was sinking, without ceremony, her lights guttering one by one. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. The humming faded as I drifted away. But the water still glowed under the hull, tracing those shifting lines. Watching. It felt like watching. I turned
and began rowing toward the silhouette of land. Every stroke was harder than the last. My limbs were leaden, my lungs raw. It felt like moving through syrup instead of seawater. I don't know how long I rowed. Time had lost any sense. My vision blurred, my thoughts unraveled into fragments. Grayson's face pale in the lightning, the compass spinning, the cold. When the keel scraped bottom, I almost didn't register it. Only the sudden jolt brought me back to myself. I raised my head. Pale sand stretched ahead, the shore steep and narrow, flanked by jungle that pressed close to the waterline. The trees were taller than any I'd seen, smooth trunks rising in columns into a canopy lost in darkness. I half stumbled, half fell out of the boat. My legs buckled, dropping me to my knees in the surf. For a moment, I stayed there, hands buried in the wet sand, too tired to move. Behind me, the sea was still and silent. The Mistral dawn was gone. I didn't remember seeing her sink. The realization struck me with a hollow finality. I was alone. No radio, no beacon, no hope of rescue that I could count on. I raised my head, staring into the dark fringe of jungle. The smell was stronger here, that sweet, almost perfumed note I hadn't been able to place. It clung to the air, thick and cloying. I tried not to think about the patterns in the water, about the way the humming had threaded through the storm, about the certainty I couldn't shake that something had brought us here, and that it hadn't finished. I forced myself to stand. My legs felt hollow, unsteady. Every step sent dull shocks of pain up my spine. But I knew if I stayed in the surf much longer, exhaustion would win. The lifeboat bobbed behind me, half grounded on the sand. I pulled it higher with what strength I had left, until the keel dug into the dry slope above the tide line. It wasn't much, but it was something, some measure of control over the chaos. I scanned the beach. It curved gently in both directions, hemmed in by steep rock outcrops. No sign of footprints, debris, or any evidence this place had ever known another human presence. The jungle started only a dozen yards beyond the sand. Trees with smooth, silvery trunks rose in perfect columns, their canopies weaving so thickly overhead, the morning light broke in dim, dappled patterns. Vines hung in dense ropes from the branches, some as thick as my arm. I looked for a path, a trail, any sign that the undergrowth might be passable. Nothing. My throat was dry. I pulled my canteen from the emergency pack strapped to my shoulder and took a cautious sip.
The water was warm, but it steadied my hands. Focus. I took inventory. 2 liters of water, a folding knife, a flare gun with 2 cartridges, a thermal blanket, and a ration pack meant to last 48 hours. Not much. Certainly not enough if rescue was days or weeks away. I forced myself to take slow breaths. I'd survived worse. Storms, fires, even a mutiny years ago in the Pacific. I could survive this. That thought settled over me like a thin shield, enough to let me move. I started up the beach, scanning the tree line for any gap, any break in the green wall. My boots left clear impressions in the wet sand, an odd comfort, proof I was still here, still tethered to something solid. Halfway up the beach, I saw the first anomaly. At first glance, it was nothing, just a cluster of small white objects half buried near the high tide mark. Shells, I thought, relief flickering in my chest. Maybe I could find something edible among them.
I knelt, brushing sand away. Not shells. Bones. Small ones. Birds, maybe? But as I uncovered more, a pattern emerged. Dozens of tiny skulls arranged in a spiral, each facing inward. I swallowed, throat tight. My hand hovered over the arrangement, unwilling to touch it. The bones were bleached perfectly white, as if they'd been here a long time. I forced myself to stand. Don't think about it. Don't let your mind start inventing reasons. I turned away, continuing along the tree line until I found a narrow gap between two trees, a break in the undergrowth just wide enough to slip through. The ground beyond was soft leaf litter, marked by shallow depressions I couldn't identify. Not footprints exactly, more like places where something heavy had rested, then moved on. I stepped into the shade. The smell hit me at once, stronger here, that same sweet, almost rotten perfume. I pressed a sleeve over my mouth, blinking back sudden tears. The deeper I went, quieter it became. My own movements sounded amplified, the rustle of fabric, the crunch of leaves under my boots. No bird calls, no insect drone, only the occasional creak of high branches swaying. I moved carefully, marking the trunks I passed with shallow cuts of my knife. If the undergrowth closed behind me, I'd need some way to retrace my steps. After 20 yards, the path ended in a small clearing. At its center stood a mound of stones, maybe 4 feet tall, shaped roughly like a cairn. Someone or something had built it deliberately. I approached slowly, heart thudding. The stones were smooth, uniform in size, and set in precise layers. On the uppermost slab, a symbol had been scratched into the surface. A circle, crossed by a vertical line. I'd never seen it before. It didn't look like any maritime signal I knew. A sudden chill prickled the back of my neck. I turned, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable, pressing against my ribs like a physical weight. I backed away from the cairn, keeping my eyes on the tree line. When I reached the edge of the clearing, I turned and retraced my path, counting the cuts I'd left in each trunk. By the time I stepped back onto the beach, my breath was ragged. The sun had shifted, climbing higher over the water. I didn't remember the hours passing. I didn't remember stopping. I forced myself to focus on what I could control. Securing supplies, rationing water, making shelter before dark. But even as I worked, I kept glancing at the tree line. And each time, I half expected to see that circle and line symbol staring back at me. The first night on the island passed in fits and starts. I'd pulled the lifeboat farther up the beach and wedged it between 2 driftwood trunks to use as a windbreak. I laid the thermal blanket over the sand, curling up in its thin shell of warmth and listening to the surf scrape the shore in long, deliberate sighs. Every time my eyes closed, I saw the bones, the cairn, that symbol etched in the stone, simple but deliberate. When I did sleep, I dreamed of the storm, except in the dream there had been no wind, only that low humming, rising until it shook my bones apart. By dawn, my limbs ached from cold. My mind felt hollow, the hours a smear of waking and half-dreams. I stood, joints stiff, and looked out over the water. The sea was flat, the same dull pewter as before. No ships,
No sign of the mistral dawn. I forced myself to eat a quarter of a ration bar, washing it down with sips of warm water. The taste was stale and metallic. When I'd finished, I wiped my mouth on my sleeve and turned back to the jungle. I had no choice. If there was fresh water, I'd have to find it soon. 2 liters wouldn't last another day in this heat. I gathered what was left of my supplies and marked the spot on the sand where the lifeboat sat. Then I stepped back into the tree line, following the same narrow trail I'd found the day before. The air under the canopy was damp, heavy. That sweet, rotting scent clung to my skin. Each step felt more difficult than the last, as though the trees pressed in behind me, sealing the path shut. I counted my cuts in the trunks, confirming my direction. But after the 6th mark, I stopped. The bark here was unmarred, no sign of the slash I'd left the day before. A cold prickle crept down my spine. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trunks. My notches were gone. I swallowed hard, forcing a breath past the tightness in my throat. It didn't matter. I'd remember the way back by sight, by feel. I had no choice but to go on. I pushed deeper into the jungle, moving slowly. The trees grew taller here, their trunks too wide to encircle with both arms. Pale vines dangled from the canopy, some as thick as rope. The ground sloped gradually upward, the air thinning with each yard. After an hour, though it could have been longer, I heard water. A thin trickle at first, then the unmistakable sound of a small stream. Relief swelled in my chest, bright and fierce. I quickened my pace, ignoring the branches that snagged my sleeves. The stream emerged from beneath a tangle of roots, clear and shallow. I knelt, dipping my hand into the flow. The water was cold, startling after so many hours of stale rations and sweat. I cupped a palmful to my lips, the taste sharp and clean. As I drank, I felt the pressure ease, if only for a moment. Then I looked up. Across the stream, in the thin band of soil between roots and moss, something had been arranged.
A line of stones, each no bigger than my fist. At first I thought it was another cairn, half collapsed. But as I studied it, I saw the pattern. A spiral, perfectly formed, winding inward to a single point. I rose slowly, my heart hammering. It wasn't the spiral itself that unsettled me. It was the knowledge that someone, or something, had built it since the day before, and that it was waiting where I would have to see it. My throat felt tight. I scanned the trees, the shadows, but nothing moved. I wanted to call out, to demand some answer, but the hush of the jungle pressed against my ribs, swallowing every impulse. Even my own breath felt borrowed. Instead, I stepped back, 1 foot at a time, never taking my eyes from that spiral. When the trees closed around me again, I turned and started back the way I had come. The light under the canopy never changed. The air never stirred. Time was a flat line I couldn't measure. When I finally emerged onto the beach, my heart lurched with relief, so strong it made me weak. The lifeboat was still there, tilted in the sand. The ocean still stretched out in its indifferent gray. I dropped to my knees beside the hull, pressing a hand to the warm fiberglass as though it could anchor me to something real. As dusk crept up the shoreline, I thought of Grayson, of the crew I hadn't seen since the night of the storm. I told myself they'd made it to another shore,
that rescue would come for us all in time. But as darkness pooled between the trees, I couldn't shake the certainty that this island didn't want us found, and that it had already decided who would leave. I don't remember lying down. One moment I was sitting against the hull of the lifeboat, watching dusk melt into night. The next, I was waking in darkness so complete it felt like being underwater. My hands were trembling. My throat was raw, as though I'd been shouting. But the beach was silent. No waves, no wind, only the thick hush pressing against my ears. I sat up, feeling the grit of sand clinging to my skin. For a moment I didn't move. I was afraid that if I looked away from the boat, the trees would be closer, that I'd see that spiral traced in the dark. When I finally turned, the jungle was a flat black wall. Nothing moved. I stood, every joint aching, and fumbled for the flare gun. My thumb brushed over the cold metal of the trigger guard, the weight of it grounding me. I raised my eyes to the sky. No stars, no moon, only a darkness so uniform it seemed to swallow any light. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to fire the flare right then, to carve some proof of my existence into that indifferent sky. But some deeper instinct held my hand. The same instinct that had stopped me from scattering the bones on the beach, that had made me back away from the cairn. Instead, I waited. I don't know how long I stood there, motionless, listening for any hint that I wasn't alone. My heartbeat was a dull drum in my throat. My breaths came shallow, measured. At some point, I realized the smell was stronger. That sweet, rotting perfume. It clung to my skin, soaked into my clothes. I pressed a sleeve over my mouth, but it didn't help. I turned back to the jungle, and I saw the light, a faint, bluish glow, deeper among the trees. Not bright enough to cast shadows, just a suggestion of something moving, flickering. Every part of me rebelled at the thought of following it, but I knew I would, because the alternative, staying here in the dark, waiting for dawn that might never come, was worse. I took one step, then another. The sand gave way to leaf litter, soft and damp. The glow retreated as I moved, always just ahead, weaving between the trunks. I tried to mark my path in my mind, but after the first dozen yards, the trees became indistinguishable, a labyrinth of identical columns. The smell grew thicker, syrupy, until it coated the back of my throat. I stopped when the clearing opened around me. At its center stood another cairn, taller this time, nearly to my chest. The same pale stones, stacked in precise layers, but this one was different. Someone had pressed something into the top, a shape I recognized even before I reached it. My compass. I stepped closer, breath caught in my chest. The casing was cracked, the face splintered, but the needle still turned, circling without pause. A mindless, endless orbit. I reached for it. My fingers brushed the glass. The glow intensified, filling the clearing with that cold blue light. My breath turned to vapor, curling in the air. The hush deepened until I couldn't hear even my heartbeat. In that silence, I felt it. A pressure against my thoughts. Something vast, patient, not hostile, just aware. Watching me the way a man might watch a fish, curious but unmoved. My hand hovered over the compass. I didn't know what it wanted, or if it wanted anything at all. I swallowed, forcing myself to speak. My voice came out hoarse, ragged. What are you?
No answer, only the slow turn of the needle. I don't remember leaving the clearing. When I came back to myself, I was kneeling in the sand beside the lifeboat, my palms still open as if I'd carried something. My skin was cold, my lips cracked and bleeding. The first light of dawn was seeping into the sky. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, but when I looked down, I saw the compass in the sand by my knee, the glass still broken, the needles still circling. A sound rose behind me, a soft sigh, like breath exhaled across the beach. I turned, heart stuttering. Nothing moved, but the certainty settled in my chest, cold and absolute. This island wasn't empty. It never had been. And whatever lived here had decided I was part of it now. Dawn came slowly, the light reluctant to cross the water. I sat beside the lifeboat, the compass cupped in my palm. The needle no longer spun. It pointed firmly toward open sea, as if the strange force that had pulled us off course had finally let go. My throat was raw, my lips cracked from thirst and salt. Every muscle throbbed with fatigue. But under that dull ache, there was a single clear thought. I had survived the worst of it. I stood, legs trembling, and looked across the flat horizon. The sea seemed ordinary again. No phosphorescent spirals, no unnatural calm, only waves rolling toward the shore, glittering in the dawn. It felt almost like the world had reset itself.
I secured what was left of my supplies, one mouthful of water, a shriveled ration bar, and climbed into the lifeboat. The fiberglass hull shifted under my weight, rocking gently. I took a long breath and set my hands on the oars. Each stroke was an act of stubborn defiance. My shoulders burned, my vision blurred, but I kept going, counting the pull and release, fighting the urge to look back at the jungle. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, baking my skin. I paused only to sip the last of the water. My thoughts drifted, circling the same questions. What had brought us here? Why had I survived when the others hadn't? I had no answers, and maybe never would. But at least now there was nothing watching me from the trees. Near midday, I spotted something on the horizon, a thin smudge against the glare. My heart lurched. I squinted, shading my eyes. Slowly, the shape resolved into a vessel, a real ship, large enough to break the monotony of the waves. I fumbled for the flare gun. My hands shook as I raised it over my head. When I squeezed the flare, it burst in a bloom of bright red, trailing smoke into the sky. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the ship altered course. A ripple of relief went through me so intense I nearly sobbed. I raised both arms, waving until my shoulders screamed. The vessel drew closer until I could see figures moving along the rails. Someone lifted binoculars, another gestured, and a voice crackled over a loudspeaker in a language I didn't recognize. I didn't care. It was real, solid, proof that I hadn't drifted into some other world after all. When they reached me, the rescue crew wore pale uniforms and clean gloves. They leaned over the side and threw down a line. I clutched it, feeling the rough fibers bite into my palms. When they began to haul me up, my legs nearly gave out from relief. Strong arms pulled me aboard. For a moment, I lay on the deck, gasping. Sunlight poured over me, blinding in its ordinariness. Someone knelt at my side, speaking softly. They offered a bottle of water. I drank in greedy gulps, the liquid washing the soft and fear from my mouth. I managed to find my voice, though it cracked on the first attempt. Cargo vessel, Mistral Dawn, went down 2 nights ago. The medic nodded, exchanging a look with one of the crew.
I didn't care what they thought. Let them believe I was delirious. I knew what I'd seen. They wrapped me in a blanket and helped me sit. I looked back at the sea. The island was visible in the distance, just a dark green smudge rising out of the water. No sign it was unusual, no sign of the cairns or spirals or that humming in the dark. But I knew what waited there. As the rescue ship turned away, I closed my eyes. I felt the slow roll of the engine under my spine. I'd never been so grateful for the simple mechanical thrum of a vessel in motion. I would never set foot on another island without thinking of this place. But I was alive, and for now, that was enough. When I finally looked up, the coastline had vanished behind the haze. All that remained was open water and the thin, unmistakable line of the horizon.